So for those of you who are just joining us, you are at the 2020 Collaborative Journalism Summit, and I'm Stefanie Murray, the Director of the Center for Cooperative Media at Montclair State University. As a reminder, we're using the chat function that you can see on your screen to communicate with you, so you can communicate with each other. If you have any questions for panelists during the next conversation, please drop those in the Q&A. So now let's move to our next session. So it's focused on a local that matters profilee, the Seeking Conviction project led by Carolina Public Press. I'd like to first introduce Mark Fuerst, who is the director of the Public Media Futures Project at the Wyncote Foundation. So Mark, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Stefanie, and the people at Montclair. Thank you to the Wyncote Foundation that made this possible today. And thank you to our two speakers who you can see on your screens right now. Everyone who's watching today, all the journalists, I think share common objectives: to share important information, sometimes to expose wrongdoing, and occasionally to change the law. And Carolina Public Press did that in the excellent project that you're about to see described. They could only do it through a multi-platform, multi-organizational collaboration, which you are about to hear about from Project Director Stefanie Carson and Managing Editor Frank Taylor. So Stefanie, let me turn it over to you.
Say as an organization, we're honored to be featured in this way. I feel like I'm among, giants across the world, and it's so great to hear all the work that everyone's doing. But we're here today to talk about our project, Seeking Conviction. And first, I want to, acknowledge that that we had some other partners, as folks mentioned. There were 10 other media collaboration partners that joined us on this project. So definitely want to acknowledge them. But we want to tell you today first where we're going. So where we're going is we're going to tell you who we are and what we do, and then move on to the idea, where this project started, and then where it took us and what we learned from it. And most importantly, we want you to leave with tools that you can actually take this back to your own organizations and do a project like this. And I think Frank is going to tell you a little bit about Carolina Public Press and just
right. Yeah, thank you for being with us today. So Carolina Public Press, based in Asheville, North Carolina, we are independent, we are nonprofit, we are an organization that focuses on investigative and in-depth reporting. I had somebody this week saying, well, why don't you cover the sports things? Like, well, I like sports, but that's not what we do. So our mission is focused on public interest journalism, focusing on this very important hard news reporting that we think is in short supply these days.
And so, as Frank mentioned, we started because we thought that there was a shortage of investigative in-depth news. We started in 2011 with a focus on the westernmost counties, the 18 westernmost counties in North Carolina, and then took it statewide in 2018. And so, our focus is investigative. We're not going to do stories that are coming from a press release. We're going to dig deeper. And so that's what we did with this project. And just a short note about who we are. I am Stefanie Carson. I come from a journalism background of about 20 years. I worked for Bloomberg and CBS and now for Carolina Public Press. But prior to coming to CPP, I spent 10 years after being a special projects producer at CBS, which is project management in and of itself. I also managed events that had nothing to do with journalism, that kind of teed up to this position at CPP with an ability to understand journalism as well as understand how to herd cats. And I tend to do a lot of that. And when I'm not doing all this, I'm a ski bum.
And I'm Frank Taylor. I sometimes will call Stefanie when there's a stray cat, but I'm a managing editor of Carolina Public Press. And I've been in journalism for about 26 years in North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Working mostly on the print media side, but since 2015, I've been with Carolina Public Press, which is an all-online publication.
And so we want to talk about, where this all started, Frank, and if you want to tell them, where did this start?
Sure. So we got to start in 2011 in Western North Carolina, which is the mountainous region of North Carolina, based in Asheville, which is the biggest city there. But in 2018, we began to expand, and we went statewide. And we've seen tremendous growth since that time, and we did this project we're going to be talking with you about in late 2018 and early 2019.
And in terms of beginning with this project, Frank, where did that start?
I'm sorry, Stefanie. Yes, it began with a tip. And the tip was, we heard that there's no sexual assault prosecutions taking place in a particular county. And we looked into it, interesting tip, and the tip wasn't quite right, but there was enough to it. We said, you know, we're finding something here. If we look at the data statewide, what would we find? And if we wanted to talk about this, even at the local level, we need a benchmark to know, is this county something we just happen to get a tip about, or would this be true in a lot of counties? And so we said, we are interested in trying to find information to show us what this would be like across the state.
And then next, Frank, you know, talk about the data.
Oh, sure. Sorry. So, you know, we went and asked the state for data. We had some recommendations from people on the data. And we talked with people who are experts on sexual assaults in North Carolina. And they said, well, if you want this information, you need to look at the Administrative Office of the Courts statewide data. So we did that. We went and asked for it. And we were looking at it. We actually were talking with an organization that was a potential partner on a collaboration. We were already thinking about this being a good collaboration. And we talked with, said, you know, I've worked with this data before. We then went and got a much bigger set of data, and it was difficult data to work with. And so at that point, we needed a data superhero. And fortunately, at that time, we had hired Kate Martin, who's from Papers in Washington State. And Kate is our data superhero. She's a real terrific data journalist. She's a terrific journalist all the way around, but had a great ability to really get into the data that we found, to clean it up. Well, she started looking at it and found out this data was a mess to work with, to really be able to use in the way we needed to analyze it. Fortunately, her husband, who's a nuclear scientist, is also an amazing coder, and he wrote a Python script to help us to untangle the data and then to get where Kate could put her skill set to work in analyzing it. And we did that. It took a while to get this done. But when we got through analyzing the data, and Kate and I worked together to develop a methodology to say, what is it we want to know? How do we query this data and find out what we want to know? We had a story.
And so we're going to take a look at the next slide and talk about the need for collaboration. And so we knew we had a story. We knew we had a front page story. And so why would we share it? Why would we share the wealth? And there are some very specific reasons for that. One is geography. This story covered a large part of the state in various unique communities. And so we needed various partners that understood those communities. We also knew about exposure. This was a significant story, and if we got together with other media outlets across mediums and across communities, we could reach more people. We were also able to pool resources. You know, we had a gift with Kate Martin being the data genius that she is, but we, you know, enlisted partners that had experience making interactive maps or had great photography skills. And so we were all able to pool that together and reduce the cost of the project. And also, for as brilliant as Kate is with data, we also felt that it's always good to have someone look behind you, right? I mean, when you're going to make the accusation that we ended up making from the data, it's good to have a couple other data geniuses, which we found in the state, that could kind of look behind Kate and say, you know, that's you're right, you're on the right track. And so we're going to take a look at the next slide and talk about, you know, how we chose partners. And we chose partners based on their geography, their expertise, their audience reach, because we wanted to reach not just digital, but also television and print. And we're going to take a look at that next slide, the choosing partners slide. And also looked at their audience reach as well as our individual relationships. In some cases, we had already worked with some of them before, and so it was helpful to kind of know what we were getting into. Our initial goal was 5 partners, and we sought those out and shared a very short synopsis of our findings and discussed basic project expectations. So next, the next slide, then what? What happened? We found 10 partners and we developed a memorandum of understanding for them to take a look at, and it just established, quality of work expectations, the basic premise of the investigation, established a trust that no one would scoop the other, and also set the tone that, our organization would be doing the legal review of the stories, as well as submitting the stories on all of our behalf for awards. So it just kind of laid things out, and we're happy to share that MOU with you as well, if that's of interest. So just moving on to the next slide, talking about the challenges we faced. Google Docs, what can I say? And since then, I've looked for other great ways of sharing information, and I keep landing back on Google Docs. But it was a challenge because not everyone understands how to access Google Docs. If they're logged into their personal email, then it says they don't have permission. So there was some education that we had to do on that.
And I will admit that I was one of the Google Docs resistors, but I came around and realized that it was a crucial tool for a project like this, where we're working with multiple partners, and we just have to figure out, how we're using it correctly and make sure everybody's on the same page. I think one of the challenges we faced was making sure that the very complex data analysis we had done could be articulated clearly to the partners. Obviously, if we're going to articulate it clearly to our listeners and our readers, with our audience, then we want to make sure that our partners at the very least can understand it, especially as they're going out and they're trying to talk to sources on their own. They need to understand it. And there were some little hiccups with this, where people would go out and talk to district attorneys, and they said, well, wait a minute, we don't think that you've done the methodology right. We think this is wrong. And we had understood the methodology and understood the data well enough by that time that we could go back and check. And they said, I prosecuted this particular case, so surely my data for my county should look better. But we were able to go back and say, no, this is why this particular case didn't show up in the data. Maybe it's outside of the time frame, or maybe it didn't fit the statutory charges that we included in our particular project. So we were able to really have done our homework, and I think we were able to reassure the partners as they needed guidance, as they needed to understand the data. It also helped us to fine tune it so that we could explain it better to readers once we actually did the core of the writing. And there were other issues with media platforms. You want to talk about that, Stefanie?
Yeah, absolutely. And, occasionally we had missed deadlines from partners. And so that was a challenge. We definitely had some takeaways from that, which we'll share with you shortly. But yes, different media platforms, what's a priority for digital and print tends to be early in the day. Television wants to tease it all day and run it in their 6 o'clock news. And so, that was definitely a challenge. But we're going to go to the next slide now. And Frank, tell them what we found.
Sure. Well, the bottom line was that when we looked at cases that were completed, so we're not talking about cases where somebody was charged and they were still waiting trial, though that is a problem for a long time, but we're talking about cases that were completed within the time window we looked at, which was 3.5 years of data, and that was the data we could get. That wasn't our choice for that time period. But we found that only about 1 in 4 cases was resulting in a conviction. Now, we expect some cases not to result in conviction. There are some people who are accused who are not guilty, and there's some cases where the evidence just isn't there. But we found, as we talked to experts, that this was fairly low, and we found some places where it was much, much lower than that. That was the statewide average. When we looked at individual places, there were places where nobody was being convicted, or every case was being pled down. So we felt like this was pretty newsworthy, and we were able to narrow it down geographically to the county and the district level. We have prosecutorial districts that are multi-county sometimes in North Carolina, and we were able to talk with great detail about those, and then our partners could go out and talk to people in their districts, in their counties, and get additional local information. So we were able to extrapolate statewide data and make it a local story for these partners.
And so next, the outcome. We want to tell you, what did we produce? We're going to go to the next slide.
So we had 4 days of coordinated publication of content. And with this content, this wasn't individual stories by each organization. Carolina Public Press wrote a core narrative. We planned out, mapped how we wanted these to work, and we pitched this to the partners, explained what we'd be doing, and they provided us with the core content in chunks that we plugged in. Sometimes they gave us a chunk for day 2, and we said, wait a minute, it's a good story, but it actually works even better on day 1 or day 4. So we moved it around as we saw what we had as it came in. Sometimes we had late copy coming in that we weren't expecting. So, oh my gosh, this changes the game. But that's a good problem to have. And we were able to do it in a way that we wove everything together. We were able to use something from every partner. And I don't know that there was any individual reporter who had work they gave us that we weren't able to use a good portion of. And so we had smooth narratives that we put together to present these. And then there were some additional sidebars. Later, there was some follow-up stories. But these were presented, each partner rolled them out at the same time over the 4 days with a little bit of hedgeway for the broadcast partners.
And so next slide, another big part of what we produced was data-rich graphics. And that was really important to this story because they were so specific to each area. So folks could really, log on to our site or our partner sites and really see what was going on. We're going to take a look at the next slide. We also had broadcast partners. We had WRIL and WLOS. And so they produced broadcast content that coincided with the release of the story. And we're going to move on to the last slide, reading community engagement. But community engagement was a huge part of our project, both before and after. As we were beginning our reporting process, we did what was called listening sessions, which is a core tenet of a lot of what Carolina Public Press does when we do a big project. We'll go out into communities and invite 30 people in a room and invite reporters. In this case, we invited fellow reporters from other outlets in this project, and they were able to really listen about the story in context. And while we knew that we already had the big story about the 1 in 4 conviction rate, there were multiple other, I don't even want to say smaller stories, but other significant stories that we were able to get from those listening sessions. And then as the project released, we do forums, which is another typical practice of ours, which we did with this. And so the forums discussed the findings, invited key stakeholders from sexual assault, from rape crisis centers, local lawmakers, state lawmakers, and we were able to have a really robust discussion. And so we're going to move on to the next slide and just talk about what we accomplished. We reached 1.5 million views across North Carolina, and that's a minimum number. Since then, that project continues to be referenced from our site and others. And we worked with 30 people across 11 media outlets, including our own. So we made new friends and new connections, and many of those are still benefiting our organization and others. And Frank, you want to tell them the other things? And
Sure.
We're going to go on to the next slide.
Yeah. So, we also had district attorney's offices, police departments coming to us and say, this is helpful information. I'm not saying that they could point to any specific change they made, but they were to look at it and say, this is helping us think. This is helping us have a conversation. We're talking about rape crisis counselors. We're talking about SANE nurses, which are sexual assault nurse examiners, all saying there are things that we could be doing differently that we want to think about as a result of this project. And the State Attorney General's office said some of the same things to us. He said, we needed this kind of analysis of this data. This had never been done before. And then now it's been done. And not only have you done the analysis, but you brought to it stories, interviews with a large number of prosecutors across the state, with police departments, with survivors of sexual assault, with people who counsel people, with people who do the forensic examinations, just all over the map, looking at the multiple core issues related and finding how it's different from place to place in North Carolina, but also somewhat the same across the board.
Yeah, and I think, going back to the data, we had access to the data in a way that even the AG's office hadn't had because of what Kate and her husband were able to do. But Frank, we buried the lead. So
we did. So after the story ran, we had seen the fourth day of the story focused on issues of 2 major loopholes in sexual assault law in North Carolina. And we found that in North Carolina, we were the only state that said if somebody withdraws consent during sexual intercourse and the other party continues with sex, that's not rape. Only state in the union that said that. It was also an issue with North Carolina not making it rape if somebody was sexually assaulted while they were passed out due to imbibing alcohol or drugs. And so there were repeatedly measures in the legislature proposed to try to change these laws. I mean, these were embarrassing issues in the law that were relics of judicial rulings from years ago. And each time they were shot down because of the very partisan atmosphere in the legislature, even though there were people on both sides who wanted to see these things changed. Well, this year, those same proposals came forward, and at the end of the year, in October of 2019, the legislature passed them unanimously as part of a broader bill on sexual assault reforms, and the governor signed them into law. These were things that people were telling us, that's not going to happen. It's going to die again. You just can't make it happen. And we were told by numerous organizations and legislators, this change happened because of the political atmosphere created by this project, by the collaborative partners, and the weight of it that all of you brought to bear on this issue by what you did and what you reported.
And that's really, where the collaboration came in, right? Because they were not just seeing it on our outlet, the legislators and the public was seeing it on multiple platforms. And so it kind of created its own drumbeat. I mean, our last community forum that we had on this in Charlotte ran about a week after the publication. And we were actually there with lawmakers telling us there's legislation moving right now. I mean, it was very exciting. And so we're going to move on to the next slide, which is probably what you all are most interested about, is what lessons did we learn? We learned that we need to make sure partners know how to use Google Docs. That sounds so elementary, but I had so many midnight requests for access to a doc. I do think that's an important lesson. We learned you lock your spreadsheet. If you're working with data across partners, lock it. We did have a situation where someone was trying to crunch data on their own and ended up changing the whole thing. Specify roles and responsibilities. I was the project manager in this, and I think I spent, too much time in the beginning trying to be polite and waiting for partners to step forward and offer what they could offer. That doesn't work. In many cases, I was dedicated to this project, but folks are doing, their portion of this project after they've fed the daily beast of the day. And working on it at 11 o'clock at night. So telling them exactly what we needed and being politely bossy about it, I think definitely carried a long way. And next time I will start that practice right away. And lastly, have a point person, have someone like myself that has this big balcony view and can kind of chase things down and protect the editorial team to let them do their thing. But also within each organization, if you're participating in a collaboration, have one person for someone like myself to reach out to. And we're gonna move on to the next slide because Frank's gonna tell you about other lessons.
Actually, Stefanie, I have to interrupt you because we are almost out of time and we have a ton of questions.
Yes.
Sorry about that. This is such an amazing project. I'm so glad that you all were able to present because the work you did was so impactful. So thank you, thank you, thank you. So for audience Q&A, so there's a bunch of questions in the chat. Stefanie and Frank, if you don't mind, we'll get to a couple of them now. If you could continue to answer them afterward, once we move into lightning talks, that would be fantastic. But we've got 5 minutes left, so let's jump in. From Rachel Hamada, question. After the success of this collaborative investigation, how do you decide your next focus when there are so many important topics to cover? And do you intend to revisit what happened with sexual assault convictions later?
I can pick up both of those. I'll do the second one first. We've already been doing that. We've already written multiple follow-ups, and we're continuing to watch this. And when we do, we reach out to the partners and say, we are producing something, or we have something that we wonder if you would like to partner on. But either way, we make sure that they continue to work with us, and we've had continued healthy relationships. As far as picking the next project, that's a little tricky. We had a project, I will tell you, that was ready to go, and then we had a pandemic hit. And so we're working on multiple ideas right now, but it is looking at the same types of things organically that happen in the news and say, we think this is an issue. We've heard tips about this, or we've done investigations on this. Maybe it's a local issue that we think is really a state issue. And so that's kind of our approach, is to continue to look for opportunities. And I would say we've done a number of projects. This was the first big collaboration, but we've done a number of investigative projects that are structured very much that way, where we begin to get a local tip and we make it a statewide story.
Yeah. Another question from Lucha in Ohio, from Ione, Ohio. She says, we've tried to gather the same data in Ohio, but we've been told that it's too expensive for the courts to gather. So she's wondering, what did it cost you to get it? Because she'd like to compare. So could you talk about that cost?
it was trivial, but it probably goes to what the courts already are putting together. In this case, the courts were compiling this data. It's literally entered by the clerks of court. So the data existed and we were entitled to it under the public records law. That law might be different in Ohio. I'm not sure where it is on that particular issue, but it was not a large expense. There was a minimal charge. We did make sure that we requested it as the database, not a printout of it. We wanted the database that we could play with it. And so, probably have a data expert help you with your request to make sure you get the right thing. But if they're going to charge you, say, for printing, you can avoid that by making sure you get it as an electronic copy, and there should be less cost involved if you can get it that way.
Laura Frank from Colorado asked, how did you gather the total views data from your partners? Because we know sometimes partners are hesitant to share that data. So how did you tile that all up?
You know, I believe if you don't ask, you don't get. And so I asked, and it took a while, and it took, in some cases, manager approval to give us the data. But we were able to cobble it together. And I mean, they were all at that point invested in the project and proud of the project. And we weren't sharing, you know, this is important. We weren't sharing individual numbers. It's not like we put up and said, you know, Fayetteville Observer had this many views. That's where it gets controversial, I think. But when it's combined, we were able to work past that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Rick Thames in North Carolina asks, to what extent do you think that you are meeting a need that may no longer be met by the AP?
I think, you know, with projects like this, I mean, first of all, the AP is a valuable resource for sure, but with projects like this that require much interpersonal relationships among media partners, I mean, we spent a lot of time doing community engagement and outreach. I mean, we were talking with NC CASA, which is the statewide organization for this, and individual organizations way before the reporting released, to talk to them about how to be mindful with dealing with this sensitive topic. I mean, the last thing we wanted to do is to tell everyone in the state that there's a 1 in 4 conviction rate and then have a victim of sexual assault not report because they think it's hopeless. To me, that's irresponsible. And so we had that dialogue. We had conversations about, do you call them victims or survivors? You know, I actually asked a survivor that question. We had therapists in the room, so if someone was there during a listening session or a forum and someone was, you know, triggered by what was being said, that they would have help right away. And we did see that happen. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that, you know, back to your initial question, Rick, that's something that the AP may not be able to do. And that's what we're able to.
Stefanie, that's such an incredible point, and actually leads really well into a question from Naima Campbell from New Jersey. She wants you to talk about how did survivors and advocates related to sexual assault in North Carolina react to your project?
Positively. I mean, you know, we talked to them about like, hey, is this right? We're finding there's a 1 in 4 conviction rate. Could this be right? And multiple partners said, yeah, we knew this. We've known this. We've known about the loophole. We just were waiting on someone to pay attention to it and talk about it. I spoke with the leader of NC CASA a couple weeks ago, and she said that, you know, that we approach them and survivors with very careful questions and respectful questions. And so they appreciated our approach. They appreciated being enlisted in the project from the beginning versus being called for a comment after we'd reached our conclusion.
Yeah, that's so important. Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you so much for your project. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your presentation today. I appreciate it.